My name is Nora Whitaker. I'm 32 years old, and on Friday night, March 14th, I was sitting at my kitchen table with a 300-page compliance binder spread open in front of me when my family celebrated the biggest deal of their lives without me. The binder smelled like warm toner and cheap office paper. I had printed it myself because my father still trusted paper more than shared drives, even when he didn't trust the daughter who understood what was inside it. Drainage plans, zoning notes, environmental responses, accessibility corrections. 5 years of problems that nobody in Whitaker and Sons Restoration wanted to touch until they became expensive enough to panic over. At 9:42 p.m., my phone lit up beside my laptop. It was my mother's Facebook post. A photo from the Mason room downtown. Private dining, white tablecloths, wine glasses raised. My father, Martin, stood at the center with his arm around my brother Camden. My mother, Celeste, smiled like she had just survived a war. Graham Voss, the broker, stood beside them with one hand on Camden's shoulder. Even Harold Mercer, the buyer, was there. The caption read, "After 30 years of sacrifice, Martin and Camden finally brought our family company across the finish line. Biggest deal of our lives." I read it twice. My name was not there. Not in the caption, not in the photo, not in the comments where relatives were congratulating Camden for saving the family business. I called my mother. She answered softly, like she had already prepared the voice. "Honey, tonight was more of a business dinner." I looked at the binder in front of me. "I worked on the business," I said. There was a pause. Then my father took the phone. "This was easier without you turning every sentence into a legal problem." I didn't answer. I just looked at the final signature page, still unsigned, and realized they were celebrating a deal they might not be able to close. Please subscribe to support the channel. Here is a fun little challenge. I bet you are watching this video while lying down with your legs crossed right now. If I guessed correctly, type 3 in the comments. If not, type 4. Let's see how many viewers I got right. And if you enjoy this story and would like to support our team, please consider buying us a cup of coffee through the link in the description. Your support helps us continue creating more meaningful, emotional, and captivating stories for you. Thank you so much for your kindness and support. All right, enough talking, let's begin the story. For a long time, I told myself the name on the side of my father's company did not matter. Whitaker and Sons Restoration had been painted on his first work van before Camden was old enough to hold a hammer, and years before anyone knew I would become the one reading the permits, checking the risk language, and catching the mistakes that could cost the company a license, a lawsuit, or both. When clients asked about the name, I smiled and said, "Old family branding." That was easier than saying the truth. The company had always been built around the son my father imagined, not the daughter who kept it standing. Camden was 29, charming in the way people mistake for competence when they have never had to depend on him. He remembered names, laughed at contractors' jokes, and made older men feel safe about the future because someone young was nodding along. My father loved that. Martin Whitaker had spent 30 years restoring old storefronts, replacing rotted beams, and teaching himself to believe instinct mattered more than documents. Camden gave him the feeling that the company still belonged to men who settled things with handshakes. I gave him the uncomfortable reminder that handshakes did not satisfy city inspectors, insurance carriers, or environmental review boards. The technical side was where I came in. Not officially, never in a way that appeared on a website or a dinner toast. When Camden missed an attachment on a permit packet, I fixed it. When an insurance rider left the company exposed, I caught it before my father signed. When my mother could not understand why the city wanted a revised drainage response on a church basement renovation, she called me at 10:30 at night and said, "You're just better at this than the rest of us, honey." It sounded like love if I did not listen too closely. So I kept answering. I answered from airport gates, parking lots, and Tessa Monroe's kitchen while soup boiled over, because I had stepped away to explain a compliance checklist to my father. I answered because saying no felt larger than the task itself. A task was 15 minutes. A no became a family discussion. A no became my mother's silence. A no became my father saying I had changed. No one ever put me on payroll for those calls. They called it family. I called it helping. For years, I did not understand those two words were not supposed to feel so heavy. The first person who named it clearly was June Calloway. June was 58, a retired city permit clerk who volunteered at the community library where I sometimes printed oversized plans because their machine jammed less than the one at my parents' office. One evening, she watched me spread out documents for the old Brickworks parcel and said, "Nora, helping people is not the same thing as letting them erase you." I laughed because that was what I did when someone got too close to the truth, but tucked inside that stack was a trust amendment with my name on it, and for 1 second, my hand stopped moving. My mother noticed before I could ask. Celeste took the page from my fingers gently, the way she took sharp things from children, and said, "That old thing? Russell Dane handled it years ago. It's just estate cleanup." I believed her because believing her was easier than wondering why my name sat inside a property file no one had ever asked me to read. 3 weeks later, Camden missed a deadline that could have killed the Mercer proposal before it ever reached a conference table. My father called before sunrise, not to ask if I could help, but to tell me the family needed me. Back then, I still thought those were the same thing. By 6:18 that morning, I was in my parents' office with my coat still on, and my hair pulled back with the elastic I kept around my wrist for emergencies. The deadline was simple enough to make Camden's mistake look worse. Mercer Senior Living Group needed a clean proposal packet by noon, and the version Camden had submitted was missing updated drainage notes, old accessibility language, and an environmental response that still referenced a project 3 counties away. My father stood over the conference table, jaw tight. Camden leaned against the window with a coffee in his hand, watching the crisis like weather passing through. "Just clean it up," Camden said. "You're good at that. Not fix it, not save it. Clean it up," like I was wiping fingerprints from glass instead of rebuilding the technical spine of a multi-million-dollar proposal before lunch. I opened my laptop because the alternative was watching my father's face collapse under the weight of a mistake he would never fully blame on his son. My mother brought me coffee, touched my shoulder, and whispered, "You're a blessing, Nora." Then she walked into the hall and told Camden not to worry. Everything would be fine. I worked until the office went quiet around me. I rewrote the stormwater section, corrected the ADA access summary, rebuilt the risk matrix, and added a timeline Mercer's reviewers could actually trust. Camden drifted in and out, asking whether that chart thing was ready. My father took calls behind his closed office door. Graham Voss arrived just before 11, smelling like expensive cologne and cold air, and scanned the pages over my shoulder, without asking if I minded. "She does good detail work," he said to my father, as if I were a careful assistant and not the reason the packet could still be submitted. At 11:47, I sent the final deck to my mother. She printed it on the good paper they kept for bank meetings. I closed my laptop and reached for my coat, assuming we were all going together. That was when Celeste appeared in the doorway holding a second cup of coffee. "It might be smoother if you stay nearby," she said carefully, "in case Camden needs anything." I looked past her into the conference room. Harold Mercer had arrived. Maren Pike was setting a folder beside him. Camden was already at the head of the table with my slides loaded behind him. "Nearby where?" I asked. My mother's eyes flicked toward the copy room. For 1 second, I waited for someone to laugh. No one did. So, I sat beside the paper cutter, with the door half open, and listened to my brother read my words like they had come from him. He mispronounced the name of the drainage basin. He skipped the line about phased remediation. I texted my mother the correction. Her reply came back almost immediately. "Please don't interrupt. He's doing well." When Harold Mercer praised the compliance section, my father put one hand on Camden's shoulder and said, "That's my son. He sees the big picture." Through the narrow gap in the door, I saw Graham turn his head. His eyes found mine for half a second. He knew. That was the part I would remember later. He knew exactly who had written the section they were praising, and he knew exactly why I had been left outside the room. Then he reached back and pushed the copy room door shut. The click was soft, almost polite. I did not know then that before the day was over, Graham would put that same instinct into writing. The rest of that day moved as if nothing unusual had happened. Camden came out of the conference room carrying my printed deck under one arm, his cheeks flushed with confidence he had borrowed but would never be asked to return. My father clapped him on the back hard enough to make him laugh. My mother touched the collar of Camden's shirt and said, "You were wonderful in there." No one asked why I was still sitting beside the paper cutter. No one asked if I wanted to hear what Mercer had said. Graham Voss walked past me with his phone already at his ear, talking about momentum and timing. By late afternoon, the company website had been updated. Camden's photo was on the front page under a banner that read, "Next Generation Leadership." I stared at it from my kitchen table with my laptop open and my dinner untouched beside me. The picture had been taken in the conference room after the meeting. My father stood on one side of Camden, Graham on the other. Both men angled toward him like he was the future they had been waiting for. The compliance binder I had built was visible in the corner of the photo, stacked on the side credenza. That was the only part of me in the room. I told myself not to make it bigger than it was. That was an old habit. Give the pain a smaller name and it becomes easier to carry. A missed thank you. A bad photo. A business decision. Anything but the truth. Then my inbox refreshed. A message from Graham appeared in a side thread labeled Mercer Closing Prep, meant for my father in Camden, but copied to me by mistake. It was only 2 sentences, written with the casual confidence of a man who had never expected the wrong person to read him. "Martin, you need to keep Nora away from the closing room. She's smart enough to slow this down, and cautious enough to scare Mercer's people." For a moment, I did not move. The fork beside my plate caught the kitchen light. My phone buzzed with a text from Tessa, asking if I had eaten. On the screen, the email remained open, plain and ugly. Not because Graham had insulted me. I had been called cautious before. Difficult, too technical, too serious. What made my stomach go cold was the purpose underneath it. He was not saying I was useless. He was saying I was useful in the wrong direction. Useful enough to fix the proposal. Dangerous enough to keep out of the room where decisions were made. 2 minutes later, the email vanished from the thread. Graham had recalled it. I almost laughed, because recall notices always feel like someone trying to erase footprints after walking through wet cement. I had already taken a screenshot. Then I saved the full message as a PDF and forwarded both to a private folder in my own account. I did not know yet what I would need it for. I only knew that for the first time, I did not want my family to decide later what had or had not been said. I called my mother before I could talk myself out of it. She answered on the second ring, cheerful in the thin way she used when she wanted the day to stay successful. I asked her why Graham thought I needed to be kept away from closing. The cheer left her voice. "Honey, he's just trying to protect your father from unnecessary complications." I looked at the screenshot glowing on my laptop. "Since when am I a complication?" There was a pause long enough for me to hear her office printer running in the background. Then she said, "You know how you get when documents aren't perfect." I ended the call before my voice could break. 10 minutes later, Tessa knocked on my apartment door with a container of soup and the expression of someone who already knew the answer was bad. She read the screenshot once, then set my phone face down on the table like the words had dirtied it. "They don't want you absent, Nora," she said quietly. "They want you invisible." I wanted to argue. Instead, I looked back at the recalled email, and for the first time, I wondered what else they were trying to keep me from reading. I did not sleep much after that. The screenshot sat in my private folder like a small locked door, and every time I closed my laptop, I pictured Graham's sentence waiting behind it. "Keep Nora away from the closing room." By Saturday morning, the words had stopped feeling like an insult and started feeling like an instruction. Someone did not want me reading something. That was the part I could not put down. At 8:13, while I stood in my kitchen with coffee I had forgotten to drink, Camden texted me a file named Technical Acknowledgment, Final. No greeting. No explanation. Just one sentence beneath it. Dad says we need this signed by noon. Don't overthink it. The attachment was 6 pages long. 6 pages for a deal my family kept calling the biggest of their lives. The first page had my name typed beneath a blank signature line. Nora Whitaker, P.E., Technical Assurance. I read the phrase twice, then kept going. The language was clean in the way dangerous things often are when someone has paid a lawyer to make them sound harmless. Compliance certification, ongoing remediation representations, post-closing cooperation, continuing technical responsibility. Each phrase looked small by itself. Together, they felt like someone setting stones into my pockets and asking me to step into deep water. I called Camden. He answered with noise behind him, somewhere bright enough for him not to understand what I was looking at. "Where's the full purchase agreement?" I asked. He sighed before I finished the sentence. "You don't name the whole thing. It's standard." I stared at the 6 pages on my screen. Standard for who? He laughed once, short and impatient. "Nora, you're not the buyer. Your family." That word landed exactly where he meant it to, not as comfort, as a leash. Family meant I was supposed to trust what they would not show me. I called my father next. I still expected, foolishly, that if I explained the professional risk clearly enough, he would hear me as an engineer instead of as a difficult daughter. Martin answered in his truck. I could hear the turn signal clicking. I told him I could not sign a technical acknowledgement without seeing the full contract and liability language. He let out a breath so heavy it filled the line. "This is the biggest deal I've ever had, Nora. Don't make me beg my own daughter to do the right thing." He had named obedience as morality, before I could defend caution as responsibility. "I'm not refusing," I said. "I'm asking to read what my signature attaches to." There was a pause, then his voice hardened. "Your brother understands loyalty. You understand liability." For 1 second, I wanted to be the kind of daughter who could sign and believe love would protect her from fine print. But I had spent too many years reading the places where fine print waited patiently for love to leave the room. My mother called 5 minutes later. I could tell she had been crying because she wanted me to hear it. "Your father's blood pressure has been terrible," she said. "Please don't do this to him before closing. Not please read carefully. Not please protect yourself. Please don't do this to him." I asked whether she had seen the full agreement. She went quiet. Then she said, "Graham says it's routine." Graham, the man who had already tried to keep me away from closing, was now being used as the reason I should stop asking questions. That afternoon, he called me himself, his voice polished enough to leave no fingerprints. "Nora, I think this has become more emotional than it needs to be," he said. "You review technical paperwork for your family all the time. This isn't different unless you choose to make it different." There it was again. If I asked questions, I was emotional. If I read documents, I was difficult. If I protected my license, I was choosing to hurt my family. I looked at the unsigned signature page, then at the screenshot of Graham's recalled email. For the first time, I did not feel guilty for refusing. I felt watched. I was about to close the file when my phone rang again. "The caller ID," said Maren Pike. "Mercer Senior Living Group." I almost let it go to voicemail because no one from the buyer had ever called me directly before. Then I remembered Graham's words. "Keep Nora away," I answered. Maren did not waste time with small talk. "Miss Whitaker," she said, "we're preparing Monday's closing checklist, and I need to confirm something. Did your family tell you that your signature is a condition of closing?" For a moment, I thought I had misheard her. The apartment was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the faint traffic on Fulton Street below my window. I looked at the 6-page acknowledgement still open on my laptop, my name waiting under a blank line, like it had been placed there by someone who assumed I would arrive obediently. "No," I said. My voice sounded steadier than I felt. "They told me it was routine." Maren did not respond right away. When she did, her tone changed. Not warmer, exactly. More careful. Then I think you should review the full closing packet before Monday. She explained only what she could without crossing legal lines. Mercer's checklist listed me as the licensed engineer attached to the compliance plan, the technical signatory for certain remediation representations, and a named rights holder connected to the parcel trust. I wrote the words down on the back of an unpaid electric bill because it was the closest paper I could reach. Named rights holder. Parcel trust. My hand stopped at that one. Are you sure it says my name? I asked. Maren said. Yes. That is why I'm calling you directly. I thanked her, ended the call, and sat very still. The phrase parcel trust pulled something loose in my memory. The library table. June Calloway's glasses sliding down her nose. My mother taking a page from my hand and calling it estate cleanup. At the time, I had accepted that explanation because daughters like me were trained to accept calm voices over uncomfortable questions. Now, that old paper no longer felt old. It felt hidden. I opened my email and searched Russell Dane. His name appeared in a message from years earlier about family property documents. I had never opened the attachment. My mother had told me I did not need to worry about it. Russell answered on the third ring. His voice was rough with age and Saturday yard work. I told him my name, then the words parcel trust. The line went quiet long enough for me to hear him set something down. You need to come to my office, he said. Today. His office was above a closed florist shop in Easttown, the kind of place that smelled like dust, paper, and radiator heat. Russell was 67, half retired, with suspenders under an old cardigan and eyes that missed nothing. He did not ask why I had waited years. He simply opened a file box and placed the truth between us. My grandfather had amended the trust when I was 24. 18% of the old Brickworks parcel had been assigned to me, not as a gift my parents could manage, not as decoration in an estate file, but as a real minority interest, requiring my consent for certain transfers. Russell tapped the page once. Your parents can sell what belongs to them, he said. They cannot sell what belongs to you. And they cannot attach your professional certification to representations you have not reviewed. I stared at my name on the document. It looked different there. Not useful. Not difficult. Legal. Russell made 2 copies before I left. One went into a sealed manila envelope. The other I scanned from his office printer and saved to the same private folder as Graham's recalled email. I drove home with the envelope on the passenger seat and did not call my parents, Camden or Graham. For once, I let them believe I was still only upset, still emotional, still a daughter who could be pressured into calming down before Monday. At my kitchen table, I placed Russell's documents beside the 6-page acknowledgment. The question was no longer why they needed my signature. The question was what they had tried to make me sign before I knew they did. At 6:11 on Sunday evening, my mother texted that we needed to talk like a family before Monday. She wrote it carefully, with a heart at the end, as if punctuation could soften what I already knew was waiting. I almost did not go. Russell's envelope stayed on my kitchen table. I did not put it in my purse, and I did not mention his name. Every reasonable part of me understood that walking into my parents' house alone was a mistake, but some older part of me still wanted to believe my mother might look me in the eye and say, Nora, we should have told you. That was not the version waiting in their living room. My father stood by the fireplace with his arms crossed. Camden sat on the sofa, one ankle over his knee, scrolling like boredom made him innocent. Graham Voss was there too, in my parents' house on a Sunday night, which told me everything before anyone spoke. On the coffee table lay the printed acknowledgment, the final page turned upward, a black pen placed across my signature line. My mother hovered near the doorway, holding a tissue she had not used yet. No one had invited me for a conversation. They had staged a signing. Martin started before I had taken off my coat. We're not leaving this room until you stop holding this family hostage. The words landed harder because he sounded tired, not angry. Like I was a problem he had been patient with long enough. I looked at the paper on the table. Is that what you think I'm doing? Camden gave a small laugh. You weren't at the dinner because you make everything about yourself. Now look at you. My mother whispered his name. But not as a warning, more like a request to sound nicer while saying the same thing. I asked for the full agreement again. I asked for the liability language, the remediation schedule, and any ownership documents tied to the parcel to be disclosed properly to Mercer. Graham leaned forward, hands folded, voice polished. Sign the acknowledgment. We can argue about feelings after closing. That was when my father snapped. His palm struck the arm of his chair. You're not an owner, Nora. You're my daughter. For a second, the room went so still I could hear the old clock in the hallway. My mother looked down. Camden looked satisfied. And I understood that in my father's mind, being his daughter meant I had fewer rights, not more. Then Camden turned his laptop toward me. A draft email sat open on the screen, addressed to Maren Pike. Nora has become emotionally unstable and is refusing to cooperate due to a private family matter. I read the sentence once, Graham said. If this falls apart, everyone will know exactly who killed your father's legacy. My hands were cold, but my voice did not shake. You wrote that before I even said no tonight. Camden closed the laptop too quickly. Not fast enough. The folder name flashed at the top of the screen. Shared Mercer project. I stood up without signing. My mother finally stepped toward me. Please don't walk out like this. I looked at her then, really looked. She was not confused. She was afraid, but not afraid for me. Afraid the deal would slip. Afraid my father would rage. Afraid the picture of our family would crack where outsiders could see it. I said, You watched them prepare to call me unstable. She pressed the tissue to her mouth and said nothing. Outside in my car, my hands shook against the steering wheel. Then I remembered the shared folder. Camden had forgotten one thing. The story they planned to tell about me had already saved itself. Before we begin, please subscribe to support the channel. And here is a fun little challenge. Check your phone battery right now. If it is above 56%, comment 1. If it is below 56%, comment 2. Let's see which answer wins today. If you enjoy this story and would like to support our team, you can buy us a cup of coffee through the link in the description. Every contribution helps us continue creating more meaningful, emotional, and captivating stories for you. Thank you so much for your kindness and support. Now, let's begin the story. I sat in the car for 7 minutes before I trusted my hands enough to drive. The dashboard clock glowed 7:04. My parents' front porch light was still on behind me, warm and ordinary, like nothing inside that house had just bent out of shape. I did not call Tessa. I did not call Russell. Not yet. I drove home with the radio off and the windows sealed against the cold, repeating one phrase in my head so I would not lose it to panic. Shared Mercer project. Shared Mercer project. By the time I reached my apartment, my fear had become something narrower. Useful. The folder opened from my laptop because I had created it 6 months earlier when Camden complained he could never find the latest files, and as the folder owner, I could still see the version history. Back then, I thought I was solving a family inconvenience. Now the screen loaded slowly, each second stretching thin, and there it was. A document titled Mercer, Response, Draft, Camden. The timestamp showed it had been created at 5:38 p.m. More than half an hour before my mother texted me to come over. I downloaded it first. Then I exported the version history, the edit log, and the metadata before anyone could think to delete it. The draft was worse on the page than it had been on Camden's screen. It did not just say I was emotional. It said I had become increasingly unstable over a private family dispute and was attempting to delay closing for personal leverage. Personal leverage. I read that phrase twice. They were preparing to describe my refusal to sign unseen liability as a kind of extortion. Camden had typed some of it. Graham had left comments in the margin. One said, "Keep this brief. Don't invite technical discussion." Another said, "Emphasize family matter, not document issue." That was the whole trick. Make me sound hurt, and no one would ask what I had read. I opened the private folder where I had saved Graham's recalled email and Russell's scanned trust documents. Then I started building a timeline. Not a dramatic one, a real one. The slide deck I had created before Camden's presentation, with the 2:17 a.m. timestamp. My mother's text telling me not to interrupt because Camden was doing well. The website screenshot naming him Next Generation Leadership. Graham's message telling Martin to keep me away from the closing room. The 6-page acknowledgment sent without the full agreement. Maren Pike's call log. The trust amendment with my 18% interest. The draft email that tried to turn all of that into my bad attitude. By 10:30, the pieces no longer looked like separate hurts. They looked like steps. First, use my work. Then hide my presence. Then ask for my signature. Then call my questions emotional. Then prepare to blame me if the deal slowed down. I had spent years thinking my family's treatment of me was careless. Careless would have been easier to forgive. This was not careless. This had structure. I sent the files to Russell with the subject line, Mercer closing urgent. 5 minutes later, he replied with one sentence. Do not confront them alone again. Tessa came over after midnight, still in her nurse's jacket, her hair pulled into a tired knot. She did not ask why there were papers across my table. She read the draft email standing up, one hand pressed flat beside the laptop. When she reached the part about personal leverage, her mouth tightened. They were going to make you the problem, she said. I nodded. For the first time all weekend, I did not feel like explaining my family to make them sound better. Tessa looked at the trust document, then at the technical acknowledgment. What are you going to do? She asked. I looked at the binder, the emails, the draft, the proof of every quiet thing they thought would stay quiet, because I usually made peace faster than I made trouble. Then I opened a new message to Maren Pike. I did not accuse anyone. I did not send the evidence yet. I only wrote one line. If Mercer still wants to close, I need everyone in the same room tomorrow morning. Before I hit send, I read it once to make sure it sounded calm. Not angry, not unstable. Calm was important now. They had built their story around my feelings. I was going to answer with documents. Maren replied at 6:40, Monday morning. One sentence. Conference room B, 9:00 a.m. Bring whatever you believe is relevant. I read it twice, while the city outside my window turned gray instead of dark. The words did not sound like rescue. They sounded like a door opening just wide enough for the truth to enter, if I carried it carefully. I packed the binder first, then Russell's trust documents, then the printed draft email with Graham's comments in the margin. I did not pack anger. Anger would be too easy for them to name. I packed paper. At 8:37, I walked into Mercer's senior living group with my coat buttoned wrong and my hands steady anyway. Their office was on the 4th floor of a glass building near the river, the kind of place with quiet carpet and framed architectural renderings of future homes, for people who would never know their walls had almost been built on a lie. Maren met me near reception. She did not hug me or whisper sympathy. She simply said, "Mr. Mercer is aware this may affect closing." Then she looked at the binder under my arm. "Do you want counsel present?" I said yes. Russell arrived 7 minutes later, carrying an old leather briefcase that looked older than Camden. He gave me one nod, not comforting, exactly, but grounding. At 8:58, the elevator opened again. My father stepped out first, already wearing his meeting face. Celeste followed with a folder pressed to her chest. Camden came behind them, jaw tight, eyes flicking toward me and then away. Graham Voss arrived last, smiling like the morning belonged to him. He leaned close to my father and said quietly, "Let me handle her." He did not know Maren was standing close enough to hear. Before we entered the conference room, Graham sent one more email. I saw Maren's phone light up in her hand. Her expression did not change, but her thumb paused for half a second. Later, I would learn what it said. "We apologize for Nora's emotional delay. Family-owned companies can be complicated. Maren did not answer him. She printed it from the room's side station and placed the page inside a blue folder. Graham had walked into the room still building the same story. He had no idea he was adding one more brick to the wall that would close around him. Conference room B smelled faintly of coffee and dry erase markers. Harold Mercer sat at the head of the table, calm, silver-haired, reading glasses low on his nose. A Mercer attorney sat beside him. I placed my binder on the table with the cover facing up. Prepared by Nora Whitaker, P.E. My father saw it. His mouth tightened. Camden stared at the cover like my name had been rude enough to arrive before he could explain it away. Harold folded his hands and said, "Before we discuss signatures, I want clarity on who is responsible for the technical representations in this deal." Graham smiled first. "That would be Camden on behalf of Whitaker." My mother's fingers tightened around her folder. My father looked at me with the warning expression he had used since I was 12, the one that meant "do not embarrass this family." But something in me had gone quiet enough not to obey it. Maren turned toward me. "Miss Whitaker, is that accurate?" Everyone waited for the version of me who would soften the room. I looked at Graham, then at my father, and said, "No, that is not accurate." The sentence landed in the room without raising its voice. No one moved at first. Graham blinked once, then gave a small laugh, the kind men use when they want everyone else to believe the woman speaking has misunderstood the room. "Nora contributed some technical support," he said. "Nobody is denying that. I kept my hands flat on the binder because I did not trust what they might do otherwise. You denied it when you told Mercer that Camden was responsible for the technical representations." Camden leaned forward. "I presented the project." His voice had sharpened. "You're twisting words." I opened the binder to the first tab and slid one page across the table. It was the original compliance slide deck, exported with its timestamp and revision history printed at the bottom. "You presented slides," I wrote it too, 17 inches the morning after you missed the drainage deadline. Camden looked down at the page, then away from it, as if paper could be rude. My father's face darkened. "This is not the place," he said. I looked at him then. "You made it the place when you celebrated my work without me, and then asked for my signature." Graham shifted before my father could answer. "This is exactly what I was concerned about," he said, turning toward Harold Mercer as if he had found his audience again. "A private family issue is being brought into a business transaction." Maren opened the blue folder in front of her and removed the email he had sent that morning. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. "Mr. Voss, this is your message from 8:51 a.m., referring to Miss Whitaker's emotional delay. On what basis did you make that representation?" Graham's smile held for 1 second too long. "My understanding was that there had been some tension," he said. "Family businesses can be complicated." Maren looked at the printed email, then back at him. "The question was not whether family businesses are complicated. The question was why you characterized a technical review as emotional delay." The Mercer attorney made a note. Harold Mercer removed his glasses and set them on the table. That small sound changed the room. Camden stopped tapping his thumb against his knee. My mother looked at the folder as if it might start speaking next. Graham tried one more time. "No one is questioning Nora's abilities. We're simply trying to prevent unnecessary disruption at a sensitive stage." I turned another page in the binder. This one showed my mother's text from the presentation day. "Please don't interrupt. He's doing well." Beneath it was the screenshot of the company website naming Camden Next Generation Leadership, posted after he presented my work. "You needed my abilities," I said. "You just needed them quiet." My voice did not crack, and that seemed to bother my father more than anger would have. Harold looked from Camden to me. "Mr. Whitaker," he said, meaning Camden, not my father, "did you personally prepare the compliance materials presented to us last week?" Camden opened his mouth. No answer came out fast enough. Graham spoke over him. "Camden presented on behalf of the company." Maren's eyes stayed on Camden. "That was not the question." The silence stretched. My brother finally said, "Nora helped. Helped. After all of it, That was the word he reached for. I looked at the page between us and said, "No, Camden. I wrote it. You read it." Graham's expression changed when Camden said, "Helped. Not guilt, calculation." He reached for the neatest exit available. "Ownership and technical preparation are separate issues," he said. "Nora may have prepared materials, but she has no authority to hold up this closing." Russell Dane opened his briefcase. The sound of the latches was small, but every head turned. He placed a copy of the trust amendment on the table, smooth as a man laying down a card he had waited years to play. "Actually," Russell said, "she does." My father stood so quickly his chair scraped the carpet. That document was never meant to give her control. There it was, not surprise, not confusion, recognition. I looked at my mother. Her face had gone pale, but she did not ask what document Russell meant. "Then why," I asked, "did Mom tell me it was estate cleanup?" Celeste's hand tightened around her folder. "We didn't think you needed to worry about it." Maren leaned forward. "Miss Whitaker holds 18% minority rights in the parcel?" Russell tapped the page. "Correct. Her consent is not optional." Graham shifted toward Camden. "I relied on information provided by the family." Camden turned on him. "You prepared the packet." Graham's jaw tightened. "Because you told me she signs things for the family." The room fractured right there. Not loudly, but visibly. People who had walked in as one side began looking for separate exits. I opened the next section of my binder and placed the 6-page acknowledgment beside the full list of missing documents. "This is what they asked me to sign," I said. "No full purchase agreement, no complete liability language, no remediation schedule. Just pages where my name absorbed the risk." The Mercer attorney took the acknowledgement and read in silence. Maren placed the draft email from the shared folder beside it, Graham's comments still visible in the margin. Harold read the line about personal leverage, then looked at me. "Is any part of this true?" he asked. My father muttered, "This has gone far enough." I answered Harold, not him. "The private family matter is that they held a celebration for my work without me, then asked me to risk my license so no one in this room would know I was necessary." My father's voice dropped. "You're humiliating us." For years, that sentence would have made me stop. I would have softened, explained, made the room easier for him. This time, I looked straight at him. "No," I said. "I'm returning the truth to the room you tried to keep me out of." Harold closed the folder. "This deal may still survive," he said, "but not with the people who lied about who made it possible." Graham's face went gray. Camden stared at the table. My mother finally began to cry, but no one moved to make her tears the center of the room. Mercer did not close that morning. Harold gave Whitaker and Sons 10 days to restructure the deal if they wanted it to survive. Graham was removed from every communication before we left the room. He tried to pull Harold aside near the door, lowering his voice the way men do when they think privacy will save them. Harold did not move. "No," he said. "We're done having private conversations that exclude the person carrying the risk." Graham's commission disappeared with that sentence. A week later, I heard 2 other clients had paused their work with him after Mercer's legal team filed a complaint. Camden lost the title before he understood what it meant. Mercer would not accept him as technical or operational authority on the project, and my father had to hire an outside project manager to do the job Camden had been pretending to do. The website changed quietly. Next generation leadership vanished from the homepage like it had never existed. Camden called me that night, angry and embarrassed. "You're making me look useless," he said. I was washing a coffee mug when he said it. I remember setting it down carefully. "No, Camden," I told him. "I stopped making you look prepared." My father came to my apartment the following week without calling first. I did not let him inside. We spoke in the hallway, under the yellow light that made both of us look tired. "You made me look like a liar in front of Mercer," he said. I looked at the man who had taught me how to hold a level straight, and who still could not see what he had asked me to carry. "You asked me to look like a liar on paper," I said. His jaw tightened. I'm your father. For once, that sentence did not unlock me. That used to be why I signed faster, I said. It isn't anymore. My mother's apology came later, at a coffee shop halfway between our homes. She said she thought if the deal closed, everything would calm down. I asked, calm down for who? She looked at her hands. I told her she had watched them prepare to call me unstable and still reached for a tissue instead of my side of the table. She cried then, but I did not rush to comfort her. I told her we could talk once a month, somewhere neutral, with no company papers, no emergency favors, and no using Dad's health as a leash. The deal eventually closed 6 weeks later, but not the way they had planned. Graham was gone. Camden's authority was gone. My 18% was recognized in writing. The liability language was rewritten, and no one could use my name, license, or signature without informed written consent. At the ribbon cutting for the Mercer Rehabilitation Center, Harold introduced me as the compliance lead who made the project safe. My name was on the plaque. My father stared at it and asked, "So this is what you wanted?" I shook my head. "No, I wanted you to stop using my name in rooms where you were ashamed to say it out loud." For most of my life, my name had appeared at the bottom of documents other people wanted me to sign. That day, it was carved into something I had helped build. I was still Martin Whitaker's daughter, but I was not his signature anymore. The lesson I carried out of that room was not that family can hurt you. Most of us learn that in small ways long before we have words for it. The deeper lesson was that love should never require you to disappear. It should not ask you to trade your name, your work, your boundaries, or your peace, just to keep everyone else comfortable. If a family only calls you loyal when you are silent, useful when you are exhausted, and loving when you are easy to control, then what they are protecting is not love. It is convenience. For years, I thought being a good daughter meant being available, answering the late calls, fixing the forgotten details, smiling when someone else received credit, swallowing the hurt because my parents were tired, because my brother needed help, because the family business mattered, because peace was supposedly more important than fairness. But peace built on one person's silence is not peace. It is a room where everyone has learned to step around the truth. And the truth is, boundaries do not destroy families. Lies do. Secrets do. The habit of using someone's kindness until kindness becomes a cage does. The strongest people are not always the loudest ones in the room. Sometimes they are the ones who finally stop signing what they never agreed to carry. Sometimes healing begins with one quiet sentence. No, that is not accurate. If this story left you thinking about your own life, your own family, or the times you were asked to stay small so someone else could stay comfortable, I hope you remember this. You are allowed to love people without letting them erase you. You are allowed to forgive at your own pace. You are allowed to step back from anyone who only values you when you are useful. Thank you for listening to Nora's story. If it moved you, please subscribe to the channel, leave a comment, and tell me, have you ever had to choose between keeping peace and keeping your self-respect? Your story may be the reason someone else finally feels less alone.